and welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of everything happening in public policy and politics. This time we are on the road still. We're in Chicago, learning all about public policy, best practices from around the country, what other states are doing on really critical policy issues like school choice, healthcare, all kinds of things. The State Policy Network annual meeting has brought together all of these policy experts, so we're going to be bringing them to you right now. Joining us this week for the Debrief, Tony Woodlief. You're in charge of the State Policy Network and everything we've been learning here. Thanks for being here. And then, of course, the CJ political reporter, Alex Baltzegar. Been working really hard this week to learn all kinds of stuff. I'm really excited to bring it back to Raleigh with us. Brooke Medina from the John Locke Foundation, and Joe Luppino-Esposito bringing us all the information we need about talking about reining in the executive branch. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is really those post-COVID policy lessons. How can we protect liberties going into the next crisis, which seems probably inevitable? But right now, coming into Chicago for SPN, Tony, you tweeted out a tweet that really caught my attention. You drove 12 hours to come here.
I did, just couldn't wait. Just couldn't wait to get here.
Good.
So
now you were asking for, in that tweet, Rob, I think we have his tweet there for the tweet of the week. You asked for music recommendations.
I did.
What won? What ended up keeping you entertained for 12 hours?
Well, okay, so I have my own road trip playlist, but the best recommendation I got, I appreciate all the runners-up, but it was a friend of mine, Gary Leff, suggested Iggy Pop's The Passenger, which that's got a good driving kind of rhythm to it.
Yeah, so that's a good one.
Thank you, Gary.
All right. Well, let's move on also, though, and talk about some of the things we've really been focusing on this week, particularly things like federalism. How do we get back to self-governance that we seem to be losing, but COVID and lockdowns really accelerated the interest in that policy.
That's right. Yeah, when people saw what happens in their schools, and also recognize the power of teachers unions, federal agencies to sort of control what is rightly in the domain of communities. I think that woke people up to some changes you have to make, and so it also points to the problem and the solution. The problem quite often is while most authority is supposed to reside with the individual, the family, the community, the state, and DC has a few confined roles, federal agencies have gradually tried to make every state an administrative district of Washington, DC. So then the solution is you've got to push back against that. And our point of view is you've got to mobilize state and local officials to exercise the authority they already have, to push agencies out of their communities.
Yeah, that's really, and you have a book called I, Citizen, so I was kind of looking through it and getting some of these ideas down. Do you feel like communities are ready to do this? They just haven't been able to have the authority to be more self-governing?
Well, so there's a couple things. First of all, the more you kind of have people who live far away deciding things for you, you become acclimated to that, and you begin to think that there's really nothing you can do. The reality is that you've got 200-some thousand elected state and local officials who have substantial authority in their various ways to obstruct, delay, impede, litigate, investigate, even refuse to comply with illegal federal directives. But most of them don't realize that. So part of our mission is to help them see the power they already have and then use it wisely. Sure.
We saw that a lot during COVID, Alex, and some of the stories you've covered have highlighted it. It feels like it really came to the surface during all of these COVID lockdowns. What have you noticed?
Yeah, and I think people didn't, at least in North Carolina, we had shutdowns for a very long time. Governor Cooper, he's a Democrat governor of North Carolina. We had shutdowns in place for close to 2 years, I believe, and I think it made people realize, to your point, how little power they had in certain regards, and so it really did kind of bring that to light and hopefully got people thinking about what control do we have versus what control do we give up to our state government versus our federal government and things like that.
Sure. I want to, Ralph, if you could bring this up from the Federalist Papers, James Madison, a quote from this. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. Joe, I'm going to come to you. Tell me what your thoughts are when you read this. I feel like we've moved away from it in a very quick way.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate because it seems like the federal government has taken the opportunity to say, look, anytime there's a crisis, we'll just step in and handle it for everybody in the states. So in the same way, the states need to be stepping up and saying, no, we do have these rights. But then, of course, it falls down from there, where then the states are acting as if they're the federal government to all the localities and everybody else. And sometimes that's appropriate, but for the individual citizen, it's often not.
It really is. Brooke, you saw in North Carolina that some people just sort of gave it up. I was surprised at how many people were willing to surrender their liberties and their autonomy to the government so quickly. Just fear, I guess.
Fear, and I would say there's just this apathy as well. People, if they don't exercise their muscles of federalism, they atrophy. And so I think that what we saw, though, during the lockdowns, and one of the good byproducts of it, was the fact that people began to awaken. Eventually, moms got tired of the schools continuing to close down. Business owners were exhausted of being told they couldn't reopen, but other businesses could. And so, as unfortunate as it was at the outset, I think it really caused people to re-engage civically and cause them to be able to develop those muscles again.
Absolutely. So if we look toward the future, Tony, when I come back to you, what policies do you think we need to be working on now? Communities, states, school boards, whatever it is. What should we be focused on now so that in the next crisis we can keep that executive authority reined in?
Well, if you sum it all up, your legislatures really have to be in charge. Both the overseeing the federal grants that come in, because that's one way that federal agencies exercise a lot of authority that they shouldn't have, and also authority over their own state bureaucracies. In a number of states, in fact, we're coming up with a report card that kind of shows for every state how exposed are they to federal bullying. And what we see is in a lot of states, they don't really have much oversight of their own agencies. They don't have legislators who are accustomed to asking hard questions and expecting data and results. They just don't do it. And so step one is remind legislators they have not just the power to do oversight, but a responsibility. They're not being responsible legislators if they're not engaging in oversight on a regular basis of state agencies and then federal agencies as they deal with the states.
Sure. Brooke, I'm going to come back to you. One of the things you and I have talked a lot about is that North Carolina is a right-to-work state. And that is something that we're really proud of. It's something that we celebrate every year, particularly the John Locke Foundation. This came up a lot during COVID when all of these small businesses were shut down. Do you feel like that awoken something in citizens in North Carolina as well?
Yeah, well, something that I was really excited about was there was an increased interest in our North Carolina state constitution and the fact that we have a fruits of our labor amendment. So it's something that causes our constitution to stand out from others because we actually define and articulate the fact that people have the right to the fruits of their own labor. And some of our friends at Pacific Legal Foundation, for example, helped North Carolina businesses fight on that front with that argument, citing the Constitution. So I think it caused at least some sort of increased engendering of the state constitution to various business owners. So that's good.
Now she's of course mentioned the Pacific Legal Foundation. Tell me about what you all have done to try and protect some of those small business owners and their right to make a living.
Yeah, so what we did in a number of states, we pursued litigation saying that they did, obviously North Carolina was fantastic to be able to have that provision in the Constitution, but even in other states where we just pursued it and said this was is sometimes inequitable. Like if there were certain businesses that were open because other ones were not, what was the reason why? And most of the time there were really no good reasons. Unfortunately, because when government claims to have a health and safety reason for doing things, then it's done on what's a rational basis test. It's the lowest level of analysis that they do and say, basically if it's not completely insane, then we're going to let the government do it. Not really a good level of analysis. But that's how we did it in the courtroom. What we did in state legislatures, obviously we worked with a lot of you folks at Locke on this as well, and 12 other states where we were directly involved, working on changing the emergency powers that the governors have. And in a lot of cases, what some of the independent health commissioners and others may have as well. Simply saying, look, if there is an emergency, it should be a short amount of time, because that's what an emergency sounds like, right? Sure. I know that the North Carolina thing I was told was, once the hurricane comes through and the power and the water are back on, then the emergency is starting to wind down. But when you have an emergency that goes on for upwards of 2 years, it's not really an emergency. It's just now a problem we have to deal with. And the legislating can't be coming from the governor. It has to come from the legislature.
Very interesting. So what are your thoughts on this this idea of the access to your livelihood?
Well, I think the benefit of that, of course, is it's essential to your autonomy as an individual. In America, part of the purpose was to give people, it's an experiment in liberty, right? Mm-hmm. There's always a challenge politically as we conceptualize more and more things that we want as rights. You sort of elevate them to a point that it's hard to have a kind of the discussions you need to have in legislatures when you're making policy. If everything's a right, well, you can't infringe on that at all. It's a means of sort of taking it out of the debate. Mm-hmm. So there's a cost to that, right? Because each side has learned, if I want something politically, I don't necessarily need to argue about it and compromise if I can make it into a right that no one can question. So there's just a cost with that trajectory in the country.
Okay, good. Where do you think we need to go policy-wise as we move forward to protect, business owners from that kind of government oversight?
Yeah, well, so I think, looking again at some of the agency powers, like there's a lot legislatures can do, first of all, to oversee agencies. The state of Tennessee has a great law that gives average citizens easy access to injunctive relief. So if an agency wants to shut down your business for 16 months while they investigate whether you're polluting the water or not,
right,
knowing full well you'll be out of business. In Tennessee, unlike every other state, you have pretty easy access to injunction to stop that.
Sure.
So legislators can look at what's working in other states and protect citizens. So I think that's part of the challenge is the more legislators do their jobs, right? And lawmaking is the first step, right? It's not the last step. It's the first step, and you have responsibility to oversee the implementation of the law. That's part of the legislator's job. The more they do their jobs, the less you have to kind of create carve-outs and say, well, this is a right that nobody can touch. Instead, hold agencies accountable.
Sure. We were just talking about Emergency Powers Act. North Carolina was in the budget last year.
Yep.
You covered that. Tell me a little bit about what that means for North Carolina.
Yeah, so like we were talking about earlier, Governor Cooper's executive powers, emergency powers lasted for like 2 years.
Sure.
What we did in North Carolina is you're no longer able to do that without consent of the Council of State, which is a part of the executive branch. I believe there's about 8 elected members. I might be a little bit off on that.
I think 10. If you count the governor and lieutenant governor, it's 10.
There you go. So it divvies out that power a little bit to not be all confided into one man who can go on a tear of a 2-year emergency powers.
Sure.
But yeah, that was something the legislature really was passionate about because they saw the consequences. They obviously disagreed with the governor on that, but they had no recourse action to stop him from doing it. So now they put that in the budget and it got done.
Sure. And there were a few times that the governor avoided holding Council of State meetings on end, just months and months, and wouldn't hold them because then he'd be forced
avoided
to put
press conferences with media too. Nothing in person. It was all over Zoom. Not taking questions.
That was an alarming part, just as a member of the media, that he would. They had press conferences, but no one was allowed to be there in person. And to get the code to log into the webinar press conference was very selective. Only some people got it.
Right.
So that was another alarming part in protection of the media and what government overreach can do. Very interesting. Joe, I also wanted to see if we could. Do you think we got something out of this? I mean, there's got to be a silver lining, right? That are people more aware? Do you think that this jump-started some of the policy initiatives that we've all been talking about for years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this alerted a lot of people at all levels, both state and federal level, as to what really needs to be done and who's really in control of what you're doing. Like I said, obviously the emergency powers, you found things like in Virginia where they realized, well, even if you restrict the governor, the health commissioner can still do decrees on his own, right?
Sure.
And then at the federal level, they started looking at things that long-standing separation of powers issues that we've been looking at Pacific Legal Foundation, such as issues regarding who's actually moving rules forward and moving other initiatives forward, right? So we have things like the Ensuring Accountability and Rulemaking Act that's going on at the federal level. It actually just got through the House of Representatives a few months ago. And that says nobody who has not been appointed by the Senate and appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate can actually start or even sign off on a rule. Because what we found over the years doing a lot of research is that particularly in agencies like HHS and particularly in the FDA within the HHS, well over 90% of the rules passed were by career employees. There's no political accountability. There's no way to touch those people. So in the same way we said, well, gee, if the governor who's not up for election this year and is really otherwise untouchable can just make all these emergency decrees, there's really no feedback you're going to get from the people, whereas you would have that if you had a better connection like through the legislature or some other means.
Sure. Would this mean anything for things like executive orders, or is this just agencies?
So this is particularly just agencies and rulemaking, but there's also been a major effort at the federal level as well to pull back on emergency powers and really examine what that is. Right now we still have emergency orders and executive orders that were declaring emergencies that date back to 1970s.
Right.
Issues with the Iran hostage crisis. I think we figured it out. At least that part of it, we figured out. So there's actually a really strong bipartisan effort that's happening right now up on the Hill to say, look, there's an election coming up. We don't know who's going to win. I think both sides are starting to say, do we really want to make sure that the next person who's not going to be in my party will have that power? And I think there's some realization around that.
Very interesting. We have a little bit graphic there, Rob, if you've got of what that act would do. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I think our North Carolina Senator Ted Budd is one of the sponsors of that.
Yes, you've been a sponsor when he's in the House side. So yeah, so we're definitely hoping that they pick that up again and really run with it. Again, getting it to the president's desk can be difficult,
Sure.
but at this point, we're going to keep giving it a shot.
Does it look like the House, you had a good showing in the House?
Very good showing in the House. Yeah, unfortunately, it was a more of a partisan vote in that particular case. But again, we think this is something that's just good governance, and both sides should be in favor of it. Because I think, particularly in Washington, I'm sure it happens in a lot of state capitals as well. It's a short memory of who's in charge, and I think when one side is in charge, they're very happy with the way things are going, and they forget that in a year or two, it's going to be the other way.
Right. Is this something you're thinking about shaping for states as well?
Yeah, exactly the same thing.
Okay.
Formatted a little differently, but there's other ways to look at it, including, can the governor sign off on rules? Is there a way to actually have the governor do it? If the governor is going to stand by these actions by the agency, then so be it. And then even further, we can look at other reforms that actually take some of these rules back to the legislature. The only reason why the agencies have these powers is because they've been delegated one way or another from the legislature. I think ideally they're just going to be doing the forms and dealing with the enforcement actions. But if they're really just strictly legislating essentially through rulemaking, that needs to be reviewed. So you have states like West Virginia where no rule can go into effect until it comes back to the legislature for review. A number of other states like North Dakota have really strong joint committees on administrative rules where they get those rules back and have to look at them. They have an amount of time to allow them to go through or reject them. So it's a really good process. And I think the federal government is looking at things like that as well through the REINs Act that also got through the House of Representatives this year and other bills that would really put the power back into the legislators and not just from the executive branch to just run wild and hope they don't get checked.
Sure. Tony, what are your thoughts on this? Because we talk about a lot of the big picture issues here at SBN's annual meeting. That's rubber meets the road, right? That's actually putting this into practice. What are your thoughts on what we're doing?
I think that's great. And you also can see, there's an effort to get the REINs Act passed at the state level. And it's a beauty of federalism is you can test it out in different places and then Congress is not always known for its courage,
sure.
But if you test this in a number of places and you show the sky did not fall when we required massively expensive regulations to be subjected to some kind of democratic process,
sure.
then Congress might consider adopting it. But a lot of it just comes back to making the legislatures responsible again for governance.
Right.
When for too long they've just deferred to unelected people and shirk their responsibility.
Yeah, Brooke, we're seeing this in North Carolina to a degree, certainly during COVID. It felt like at the time now CDC Director Mandy Cohen, she was DHHS for North Carolina at the time, was deferring to what other states were doing rather than what was happening here in North Carolina.
Absolutely. It was the blind leading the blind. They didn't know where they were going. They were just kind of all in the same boat going a direction that they didn't even know where they were eventually going, and it created obviously devastating effects in terms of learning loss and then just loss of business revenues and public trust lost in that. So
that's a big one.
It's exciting that this will be democratized again in the way that it should be, bringing power back to people. I think it's a very good thing.
It is good. Alex, do you think there's an appetite for this over there? You cover the legislature.
I think back to your point a little bit about the state legislatures doing more of this. From a practical standpoint, like a lot of our members of Congress and members of the Senate come through the state legislature to launch their political careers. So I think if they can see it working in their own state, hopefully they can take those types of ideas to DC with them.
Sure. Very interesting. Okay, we're going to go around one more time before we close out. What do you think the biggest takeaway was from the COVID pandemic in terms of policy?
I think people felt helpless when it came to their children. Right? They trusted teachers and schools with their children, and they saw a combination of incompetence, indifference, powerlessness, and there's a groundswell now. With parents going to run for school boards, there's an openness to change. Crisis creates opportunity to change.
That is. That's a great way to put it. What do you think the biggest takeaway you've seen?
From the pandemic?
Yeah.
Well, I do think we saw a lot of new policy, as we've touched on. We saw emergency powers change. We saw what's happened with these the COVID vaccines. We've seen some more debate over vaccines and stuff like that. But a lot of health policy at the state and local level have been come to the forefront of political debate.
Right. Joe, actually, he mentioned the vaccine, and I'm curious, did you all do a lot of work with vaccine mandates specifically?
No, we didn't work on that
Okay.
much. But no, what we did focus on was a lot of things like it came to the right to earn a living and other
Sure.
pieces of what you're allowed to do. We did a lot of work actually on the eviction moratorium as well.
Right.
From a property rights perspective, that's one of our main pillars of what we work on. And just simply saying, look, just because the CDC made this outrageous claim on sort of, as Justice Scalia put it, an elephant in a mouse hole, right? Suddenly this thing that had never been used before, now that means you can just do a nationwide moratorium on rentals.
Right.
It's sort of ridiculous. So I think to get to your question, I think the thing that we recognize is that how, if you leave these little sort of mouse holes, I guess I'll keep calling them, that they can get into, the federal government or any executive can get into, they will use them and abuse them. We've seen that through student loans, we've seen that through the eviction moratorium, all these little pieces. The idea that, well, it's there just in case, well, someone can, if they can decide unilaterally when just in case is, they're going to use it. And I think putting the brakes on that has been a major step of what I think our focus has really changed to from a legislative perspective, even from a litigation perspective, and I think a lot of other people are picking up on that.
I think so, and skepticism, public skepticism
Absolutely.
of the government, I think, is one of the silver linings. What are your thoughts?
I want to end on a positive note and add something
Yeah.
that I think was good that
Okay.
that resulted from this, and that's like rocket fuel to innovation when it comes on the technology front. And so
Sure.
a lot of obviously when you're forced to work remotely, there was an incentive to make sure that tech was up to snuff on this, and so there was creation of new software, the advancement of the sharing economy.
Sure.
People just became a lot more innovative and creative in how they were able to communicate, how they were able to provide for their families. And so I also think that because of the lack of public trust, that led to an increased interest in decentralization of the economy, of currency, and things like that. So I mean, there's
That's
that
actually a
silver
really
lining.
good way to put it, because we've talked about this off camera as well, what it means for working women. They can stay in the workforce through children much more readily than they could have before. Folks who might have an illness or need to be ready to retire physically but not mentally, they're able to work a little longer. That says a lot. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Debrief. That's about all the time we have for now, and we're going to be headed back to Raleigh soon. Thanks for tuning in.